As part of Wisden.com and Wisden Cricket Monthly's review of 2021, today we're picking the top 10 men's test innings of 2021. I'm Rana, and I've got Wisden India editor Aadya Sharma and Wisden.com managing editor Ben Gardner with me. So we're considering innings from January the 1st, 2021 to December 31st, 2021, nice and simple. We'll be assessing them on the quality of opposition, the pitches they were played on, and most importantly, the match situation. Ben, let's start with the top two. We're not going to say in which order we're going to end up putting them in, but I think because those are the two standout innings, we'll start there and then we'll go to the rest. Ben, what are our top two?
Yeah, well, in a way, they almost couldn't be more different in terms of those two criteria you put out. So it's Rishabh Pant's 89 not out at the Gabba and Kyle Mayer's double century on debut against Bangladesh. I mean, the first is kind of like nothing but context. I mean, it was a brilliant innings by itself, but like, you know, there was a match situation there in terms of like, should he even go for the runs or should he try and bat out for the draw? Not that that would ever be Rishabh Pant's style, but still, he really went for it. There was obviously everything that had gone on in that series with India's team having been like ripped apart and, you know, all their sort of senior pros being back home or injured on the sidelines, and then just how hard it is to win in Australia. It should be one of the hardest places to go. And this was sort of like a ragtag bunch of hopefuls led by a guy who could be one of the greats, I think it's fair to say at this point, but who, you know, still young in his career, doing something that like very few players in the world could even dream of. So that obviously ranks very highly. And then it was also comes in the context as well of India's sort of overall pursuit of sort of all-time greatness and kind of global domination in a way, where they had that run of series against Australia and then England and then South Africa, places where they'd struggled, conditions that shouldn't suit them, and coming right at the start of that, it felt monumental basically. Whereas Kyle Mayers is, you know, it's not as if that was the start of something for West Indies really, or even the start of something for him. It's basically just like a complete freak, and it came in his first game, and in a like there's been one other double hundred in successful chase, and that was a very different sort of one against a kind of beleaguered England team by Gordon Greenwich, whereas this was like a really stiff chase and spinning conditions that West Indies generally struggle in. That Bangladesh spin attack is very good, and to do that was therefore just ridiculous. I mean, it felt like at the time, like even if you'd got like 140, 150, you'd be like, wow, that was incredible. To then go on and do something that no one else has ever done really, to get a double century in the fourth innings in a successful chase in a game that is in his debut, and for that to be just like a complete flash in the pan, it's such like a sort of a shooting star out of nowhere. And it's funny how it often comes down to these innings of the year thing. Like, I remember thinking about 2 years ago, we had Stokes and Pereira in the same innings. Obviously, those were very of a kind, but you still had one player for whom it was kind of like a bit of a freak, and another guy for whom it felt like his whole career had kind of been building up to that moment. This is similar in a way that you have one where it like fits quite neatly into sort of like the narrative of global cricket, and one which is just kind of like such an outlier that it's, but yeah, so those two are at the top, and I think it just depends how you weight the various factors which those will come out, and I imagine a fair amount of debates come for that at the end, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it's worth saying that we've considered well over 50 innings here, and we've whittled that down to 20 or so on our long list, I guess. And there are a couple of categories, I guess, where there are lots of hundreds within those categories. So, one of those categories is hundreds by Indian opening batters. There are some brilliant ones. Rohit Sharma had an outstanding year, kind of like a breakout year, I guess. One that confirmed this status is probably the best test opener on the planet. KL Rahul scored a wonderful 100 in England. There's a brilliant 100 by Mayank Agarwal against New Zealand at the end of the year as well. So it goes to you, Aadya. Out of the hundreds scored by Indian openers in 2021, which are the ones that stand out for you?
I think one good thing for India was that, there have been quite a few options in the recent past in terms of opening. And still, whoever comes up, whoever is selected, they sort of like perform really well. It happened with KL Rahul. And I think for him to just come out in the middle of the year and perform the way he did, especially starting with the England series and then, towards the end of the year in South Africa as well, I think his 200s really stood out. And for Rohit Sharma, because there's always been sort of a question mark over his Test career and where it's going, and he's in his 30s now. For him to score that century outside India, his first in about like close to a decade. So I think it was a great sort of like a mix of things that the openers provided. But I think for me, those two really stood out. Those two, Rohit Sharma and KL Rahul.
Yeah, you didn't even mention Yaz, the Shubman Gill 90 odd at the Gabba as well, which was also ridiculous. Those two stood out for me, and there was also the Chennai one, which was on obviously a pitch that turned a lot. And you kind of almost didn't realise how much it was turning on that first day just because of how brilliantly Rohit played. I mean, obviously that's the kind of innings we knew he could play. I guess that's the thing that was made his 100 at the Oval sort of stand out, was that, I mean, we kind of knew he could play it because he'd sort of been incrementally sort of getting up to there since he'd been promoted to Open, or since he'd come back to Open. Yeah, but this was that was like a match-winning innings overseas, third innings. And it just kind of felt, yeah, like the peak of that journey that he'd been on. And yeah, the whole one at Boxing Day was just like, felt like, watching it felt strange because it just felt like perfectly normal Test match batting, basically. Like, but then you realise everything else that goes into, like, it is a brilliant South African attack. It was really tough conditions, and he almost made it look easier than it should have been, basically. So yeah, those are the three for me.
Yeah. So Aadya, just to kind of push you on that. So how are you ranking the hundreds by Indian Overs? What's your top three from Indian Overs?
The first one would be Rohit's century in England. Just how it stands in the context of him in his career and where he stood and where, sort of changed how people look at him. With KL Rahul, I think obviously the second Rohit century is also a very good one, the one in Chennai against England again. But I think I was sort of like torn between KL's Boxing Day 100 against South Africa and the one he scored against England in England. I still feel that the England one was a little better because like the track was very flat in South Africa in the Boxing Day Test, and the bowling attack did not look as incisive with, Duan Olivier was not there, and it just felt sort of like more comfortable situation for KL Rahul to sort of score a century. So I think the one we scored in England, that was I feel a little better because the ball was seaming and he had to show a lot of control on the opening day. And I think for me that one sort of like edges the other one.
Nice one. Ben, nearly 10% of the Test 100 scored in 2021 was scored by Joe Root. And he didn't get, if we're going back how we're assessing all these innings, match context, he didn't get much support from his teammates in any of them. So if you had to pick out two Joe Root 100s from 2021, what would they be?
If I had to pick out two, okay, because for me there's actually three at the top and then like a bit of a drop to the next three. So the top two, I guess, would be the one in Trent Bridge, weirdly. I know that was one that came in a draw and in a way a very effective draw in the end. You might look at it in a few years' time and think like, what was remarkable about that? And actually, I don't think, looking back, it's easy to forget how much focus there was on Joe Root as a Test batter in England. Like in a way, there had been quite a stark demarcation between how he'd done away from home and how he'd done at home in the few years leading up to that, and it kind of all combined to an average of about 40, which was below his overall career mark. He was averaging about 50 away from home and about 30 or just over at home. And so you wondered actually if, sure, the 300 start of the year had been great, but was he actually going to be able to do it at home? He struggled a bit in those New Zealand Test matches, and then for him to then make that kind of 100 in it, and it was really important. Like, I think if he doesn't make that 100, India do end up winning that game, even though they don't get close to it in the end. And then after that one, those next 200s at home felt a bit more sort of predictable and like they were likely to happen. Like he'd shown he could do it, and it was only then just like how many he would score and how often he would just fail, basically.
The match context was different as well. The 100 at Lords was on a reasonably flat wicket. The 100 at Headingley was when England had bowled India out for nothing. So the pressure wasn't on in quite the same way.
Yeah, that's fair as well. And then the Chennai one, I mean, we have seen Root play those kind of innings before on reasonably flat tracks. We know he's maybe the best player of spin in the world. So from that point of view, it wasn't too surprising. But if you just look at how hard it is to beat India in India, even in just a Test match, like up to that point, only one team had done it in the last 8 years or so, 9 years even. So for him to do that, and for him to set up what was actually a thrashing of India, was just so unprecedented. I mean, if you're looking for a kind of unfancied England team going away from home and beating one of the best teams in the world in that sort of manner, you have to go back, 30 years to the West Indies tour in 1990. So it's so sort of unprecedented that was the one that took top spot for me. The other one that was also pretty close was the second Sri Lanka one, because Sri Lanka had been a shambles in that first game of that series. But in the second game, they'd made 380, I think, in their first innings. England actually ended up conceding a slight first innings deficit. So without Root's 100 in that game, they might actually lose that test and then draw that series. As it was, they get up close to parity and then win it quite comfortably in the end. So those were the three, with Chennai and Trowbridge out ahead.
I'm just going to pick out one more 100 from the English summer. Devon Conway's debut 100 at Lords. He scored double 100 actually against a really good England attack, home of cricket. Not a huge amount of support from his teammates. Henry Nicholls was the only other New Zealand batter to get more than 50. I thought that was a pretty remarkable innings. He scored really quickly as well. I can't remember many innings from someone on debut where they just looked like an experienced Test cricketer in that way. That it looked like there was no obvious holes in his game from minute one. I thought that was a phenomenal innings that made my list. There was a really good series between Pakistan and South Africa that people might have forgotten about at the very start of the year. Pakistan won that 2-0, but both those test matches were really close, and they both swung in a way because of 100 scored by Pakistani middle order batters at really crunch points in the match. Do either of you want to talk about those 200s quickly?
You had the Fawad Allen one coming in at 27 for 4, which was brilliant, obviously a really difficult match situation, and a great story for him just to continue that run in Test cricket. And then for me, I think the Rizwan one, which came in the third innings, just pipped it, I think. But I can see how you'd argue for either one. I mean, third innings tons for me, and for lots of people, just carry sort of like a special weight to them, and that there's sort of like lots of different ways you could play them, and you often do get pitches that are breaking up a bit, and you're stuck between sort of like trying to figure out what a good total is, and therefore how aggressively to bat. Trying to bat with your partners, trying to stretch out the innings as long as possible, but also to get as many runs as possible. So and he has shown he's a brilliant batter at playing a situation, as well as just a brilliant batter full stop. And that came no one else passed 50 in the innings, and although they ended up setting South Africa a lot and ended up winning quite comfortably, it felt like they kind of needed every bit of that scoreboard pressure, because and another innings from that series was Markram's 100 in the fourth innings of that game, and they were 240 for 3, chasing 370, 380, and if they're chasing 330 at that point, you think South Africa might win that game. As it is, when he gets out, then the weight of it all crashes down on them. So that's why the Rizwan one for me stood out. But they were both brilliant. It was also interesting just to see kind of the reversal of roles in that game. So when Rizwan made that 100, you had, I think, was it Maharaj took 5 and George Linder took 3. So you had 8 wickets shared between South Africa's spinners. And then in the chase, you had Shaheen taking 5 and Hassan Ali taking 4. So you had Pakistan's quicks doing it and South Africa's spinners doing it, which is obviously a bit you'd expect it to be. Maybe obviously Pakistan have a brilliant history of fast bowling, but you'd probably expect it to be the other way around. But yeah, it was a brilliant series, and yeah, that's why Rizwan edged it for me.
Rizwan won out of those innings in that series for you? Just
about, yeah, but happy to be debated, I guess.
Yeah, I had considered the Fawad Alam one, just because how Ben mentioned they were like some 30 odd for 4, and obviously him coming and playing in Karachi after so long in front of at his home ground and scoring after what he'd spent a decade doing that against domestic bowlers, to do that against an attack that had Rabada, Henrik Nokia, Maharaj. I think that really was special. And yeah, I mean, just the fact that he stood up after the top order had collapsed and did so well, for me, sort of that really stood out.
I'm going to pick out some couple more middle order 100s that caught my eye. Dan and Jai the Silvers 155 against West Indies. That might have gone slightly under the radar, but a really important knock in a not particularly high scoring game. Strank had a 51 first innings deficit. He scores a glorious innings. He's a very, very he's a fine player to watch. He's very easy in the eye. He gives Sri Lanka a 296 run lead that eventually was a match winning one. Quinton de Kock scored one of his last great interventions in Test cricket, scored a rapid 141 against West Indies. West Indies were bowled out for 97 on the first day. And again, very low scoring game. The Cox scores 141 to give South Africa a innings victory. I think those are two other innings scored by batters at 5 or 6 that really stand out there. I mean, there's some other ones. Aadya, Shreyas Iyer's debut 100 at Kanpur was brilliant. Hashmatullah Shahidi for Afghanistan scoring their first ever double 100 in Test cricket again. I think probably that was a very high scoring match, so probably doesn't make our list. I mean, another double 100 that we haven't talked about yet is Kane Williamson with a double 100 against Pakistan at the very start of the year that helped them qualify for the World Test Championship final. I think probably because of the pitch and match, the actual match circumstances, that probably doesn't make our top 10 list, and neither does the Hashmatullah one. But any standout innings that we've not mentioned yet that either of you guys would like to talk about?
I think there was one from Aiden Markram also. I'm not sure if we've discussed this so far, but that was also pretty good in the context of Markram himself and where his career stood. First century in 3 years or so. You'd seen Aiden Markram sort of leave such an impression early in his career and then fizzled out. And with Hassan Ali being in the form that he was, with reverse swing and all, to play those 240 odd deliveries, and that was a pretty special effort as well. And you know how Markram can be, how stable he is against the pacers and how he can sort of use his feet well against spinners. I think that was one innings. And I think the one you mentioned about Shreyas Iyer also, the fact that for so long India has been looking for a younger middle order option, and having tried out Ajinkya Rahane and Cheteshwar Pujara for so long, you need someone to come in and make an impression. And Shreyas Iyer has done really well in white ball cricket, but even he was coming off after a long sort of like period of injury and rehabilitation. For him to make an impression.
3 years, had he?
Sorry?
I don't think he played the first class game for 3 years.
Yeah, exactly. And you sort of know how he does against the white ball. He chases, he sort of like rotates the strike well. You haven't seen his defensive game as much. And for him to, get the first chance that he got in Test cricket and do so well. Even in the second innings, he was close to getting a century. So, I think it's just that because it was in home conditions and, it was sort of a comfortable environment for it. It's not higher up in the list, I feel.
One batter we've not talked about yet who was brilliant in 2021 was Dimuth Karunaratne. For me, his most eye-catching 100 was actually his smallest 100. He scored some pretty big ones, but it was his 103, I think it was, against South Africa in Johannesburg. It's one of those classical South Africa home series where they're utterly dominant with the ball, and in a test where Sri Lanka barely got over 200 in either innings, Karunaratne hit a rapid 103 against that brilliant South Africa attack in the third innings. And Ben, I think you make a fair point that as brilliant as that innings was, probably doesn't quite qualify for our list because the game was kind of gone by the time he scored that 100. So it didn't quite have the match situation like a lot of the other ones we had. But two more innings from Australia I want to talk about briefly. Travis Head, 152 on the first Ashes Test match. I actually think his second Ashes 100 was better, the one at Hobart, but that's in 2022. I think he was obviously very, very good innings at Brisbane, but I thought he dismantled a very tired England attack, and it wasn't, I think, as intense a match situation as a lot of the other hundreds we're talking about. But I mean, we're talking about Rishabh Pant at number 1 or 2 for his Brisbane innings, but his Sydney innings was also brilliant as well. I mean, that's got to be in consideration as well.
Yeah, on the Head innings, I feel similarly about this to I feel about the Kerr Hall innings at Lords, in that in some ways you almost felt like in some ways the better innings was played by somebody who made fewer runs on that day. Like Labuschagne's in that first test, that was the innings which it felt like really blunted the England attack and made it possible for Head to do what he did. And in fact, Head scored so quickly that he actually was racing through like a bowler's spell. He was racing up the runs. So actually, he didn't actually have to face many of England's better bowlers while he was building his way up to that 100. It was only when he had like 8 on the board that he was starting to. When I think that was when the secondary ball came along. And with the Kerr Hall one at Lords, throughout that whole first day, it just felt like the story was how beautifully and brilliantly Rohit Sharma was batting, and you had Kerr Hall kind of in his slipstream. Obviously, he did that brilliantly, and he did that brilliantly kind of all year. But but it's Keral's in the end was probably was a more valuable innings to India, but it was strange how to have an innings on this list that for a lot of the time it was going on wasn't even what people were talking about because there was something else happening. Not that I'm necessarily against someone getting in, but yeah, that was what I thought about Head's innings anyway.
So what do you think about that Pant innings at Sydney? Because that was extraordinary.
Yeah, well, I mean, I watched every ball of that. I was working that whole Test match, and that was ridiculous, and it felt for a time like they could maybe do something like they ended up doing at the Gabba. Yeah, I mean, I guess partly you want to just spread these around when you're picking a list like this, and
I always feel weird though if we're agreeing that Pant at Brisbane is in the top 2, for Pant at Sydney not to be in the top 10. I think that's wrong.
Yeah, I guess, but then I guess also like it was a brilliant innings, but in the end, India were trying to draw that game, and he got out, I think, just before lunch, if I'm not mistaken, and ended up still needing a brilliant rearguard from the likes of Ashwin and Bihari. And did Pujara face loads of balls in that game as well? I'm pretty sure. Yeah. So, and I know that the Gabba wasn't a single-handed effort either, but I think it is a significant level above. And also, just when you're talking about context, at Sydney, it was an innings that helped save the match. That if he hung out when he did, could have been a ridiculous match-winning innings. At the Gabba, it just was a ridiculous match-winning innings, and that's the fact that they did win that match does elevate it quite a lot, I guess.
I think this is where we start arguing. So I have ranked them from 3 to 10, kind of based on how much you've persuaded me, but also how much I've persuaded myself. So I am going with Root and Nottingham. I think that's extraordinary innings. I thought, Ben, you alluded to it, but for a couple of years, Root wasn't at his best. And when he was at his best, so even to that period, he would still, as he phrased it, he'd bang out hundreds on flat ones. And there was actually such a question mark on his ability to score big runs in home Test matches against the very best attacks. And given the match situation, given the quality of opposition, and actually just how well he batted, it was Root at his absolute best. One of the best batters of his generation at his very, very best in really challenging circumstances. So for me, that's 3. I've got Rohit in England. That's at 4. Kind of what you guys said. Fawad, his innings, I'm persuaded by Aadya that was better than the Rizwan one. Going for that at 5. The Dhananjaya 155 that we didn't spend that much talking about, but given the match situation again, I think that's got to be up there. Root Chennai going for number 7. Rizwan 8. This innings wasn't on anyone's provisional list, but I think Aadya, the way he talked about it, has persuaded me. Shreyas Iyer at Kanpur on debut at number 9. And then Devon Conway double 100 at number 10. Are there any innings there that you think should be on that list that's not on that list before we start arguing about the order?
Yeah, I think Rohit at Chennai was a decent deal better than Shreyas Iyer, personally. Like, I think it's easy to forget. New Zealand ended up drawing that game partly because the pitch wasn't as helpful for spinners as it kind of seemed. Whereas that Chennai game was just it wasn't a minefield, but it was turning significantly. England had. That was the only game for which they picked Moeen and Leach, I think. Or did they also pick them for the... No, I think that was the only game for which they picked Moeen and Leach. And so that those are England's two best wicket-taking spinners, just 2 best spinners. So actually it was a significant spin challenge for Rohit to deal with. And sometimes you get innings where a batter plays so well that it makes it seem like it wasn't actually that hard. This wasn't really one of those because it was just the crispness of his stroke making rather than like the ease of his defence that made it seem so good. Like he was just scoring so quickly, but seeming like it was so pure and so like there was so little risk involved, even though he was scoring quickly. That's why that one really is out for me. And also you just considered that, India were 1-0 down in the series. They took a bit of a chance rolling out a pitch that turned a lot more than their home pitch had before. If Rohit does go early there, or someone doesn't make a significant score, all of a sudden, England have rolled India for 200, 250 with a 1-0 lead in the series, and they're actually looking at like batting India out of the series, basically. As it was, Rohit does that, the series is a completely different complexion, and England end up getting steamrolled.
Yeah, I think I agree with Ben, because it looked like a sort of like a stretched out version of one of his ODI double centuries. There was a lot of clarity in the way he was playing the spinners. Something outside the off stump was turning, he would just take, go down on one knee and swat it across. He was playing the sweep really, really well. And I think some data, I think ESPN data about once he crossed 150, at that point his sort of like control rate was about 86%, which was like huge for a pitch that was turning so much.
Okay, so that makes a list then. What do you think roughly about the order then? If that is our 3 to 10.
Well, for me, Root at Chennai for me was the best of his three, or the best of his six, the best of those top three that I mentioned. Or at least the greatest of the top three. I do see how this was him banging out a double hundred on a flat one and doing something we've seen him do before. But I do also think just like the context of an overseas win in India is just so great. But then there is a lot of context to the home one. But the Chennai one does pick the other one for me.
Yeah, I think the Chennai one for me, obviously, for me, why the Chennai one sort of has a bit of a doubt in my head is because I think the bowling unit was sort of not that great, because you had Ishant Sharma and Jasprit Bumrah coming in, who had been injured just before that, and they looked a bit tired. And even the spin combination, you didn't have Ravindra Jadeja there. You had Ashwin teaming up with Shehbaz Nadeem, who hasn't played a lot of red ball cricket for India. And at one point, they had to sort of employ Rohit Sharma, I think. So I think just in terms of the bowling attack and how it looked, maybe that can be considered also.
So you're saying Trent Bridge, basically?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. Also, so much of Test cricket in 2021, England played the most tests of anyone else. Root scored the third highest run tally of anyone's ever got in a year. And I thought that innings just summed up Root in England in 2021 more than anything else. Just Root completely up against it and just carrying the side on his shoulders, just completely by himself with the bat. So I think, yeah, I'm happy with Root at Trent Bridge being number 3. So we've got our 3 to 10. Right. So who's top?
Well, no, as I said, but for me, it is Kyle Mayers. It's just such a freak. I get that Pant at the Gabba was also freakish, and that is one of the great Test series results of all time. But I think if you just look at it from just like match-winning double hundred in the 4th innings, those just don't happen. They especially don't happen by a guy on debut, and they especially don't happen by a guy on debut. Base doesn't do anything else after that. So I think just because of that, basically, that's what makes that take top spot for me. It just like a guy gets a double hundred in the 4th innings of a Test match and wins a game, then that just becomes the best Test innings of the year. That's like, it's as simple as that, kind of. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I think the Pant innings was totally absurd as well. But I mean, we haven't even mentioned his 100 at Ahmedabad. But yeah, Pant had an amazing year and started 2022 pretty well as well. But I think that Mayer's 100, even if you forget it's by someone who has not yet done much more in Test cricket with the bat, that is just a totally ridiculous innings. And Bangladesh are very difficult to beat at home. Last time England went there, they didn't win. The last time Australia went there, they didn't win. So to produce something like that in the 4th innings in Bangladesh, I think is pretty phenomenal. So that for me is number 1.
I think on paper for me also, if you just think about it, chase of 390, 5th highest chase of all time, you've got a debutant scoring a 200. It all adds up. But there were some phases in that innings also that were a little scratchy. There were edges flying off his bat, and Bangladesh not taking some reviews that looked plumb when catches being dropped. So I think just because of that, and given the context of Rishabh Pant's innings, in terms of the team itself, what it meant for the team, and him sort of finishing what he almost tried to do in the previous Test. It just felt like Rishabh Pant had grown up, and he was what we always assumed and wanted him to be. And by the time the series itself had entered some surreal territory, and to see sort of Pant doing what he did, a lot of versatility in his stroke play. So yeah, I think
you've almost.
You've been outvoted though, Aadya. So I think we're gonna have to go Kyle Mayers at number 1. So I'll quickly run through our top 10. Devon Conway, double 100 Lords, that's 10. Rohit at Chennai, 9. Rizwan against South Africa, 8. Root in Chennai, 7. Danny Jai de Silva, 6. Fawad Alam against South Africa, 5. Rohit Sharma in England, 4. Joe Root at Nottingham, 3. Rishabh Pant at the Gabba, number 2. And Carl Mayers, number 1. Thanks for watching, folks. We're going to be back with some more year in review content over the next few days, both on our YouTube channel, but also on wisden.com and also in Wisden Cricket Monthly. So hit the subscribe button if you want to see the rest of that. Head to wisden.com and get yourself the latest Wisden Cricket Monthly at wisden.com/shop.